Many factors played a role in the rise and notoriety of the Polish poster. Between 1939 and 1945, Poland endured the invasion and subsequent occupation of Nazi Germany and the Soviet Union. The invasions of both armies left the country devastated. Communication, transportation, and industrial capacities were destroyed. Population loss was estimated at 20% of pre-war numbers. The post-war Polish posters were patronized by the Soviet government. In other words, the Soviet government was the client. The poster was considered a national cultural art form, and a Polish poster museum was established in Warsaw. These posters were less about advertising products and more about advertising public service and cultural events, mostly because of the centrally planned economy of the Soviets. But before we look at more contemporary postmodern Polish poster artists, first, let me show you the originators of the Polish school of posters. In 1937, Tadeusz Trepkowski established this particular genre. He was largely a self-taught artist. From 1937 until his early death in 1954, he produced some of Poland's most influential posters. These are two of the most memorable. On the left, this hand-printed poster from 1948 was produced in small quantity. The headline reads, "Last Stage." It promoted one of Poland's first films of the post-war years, a drama of survival and tragedy in Nazi concentration camps. The carnation is the traditional flower of remembrance in Poland. Trepkowski shows it bent and broken as it casts a shadow on the striped prison uniform. The infamous nature of the camps is again recalled in the identification patch. Each inmate had a triangle with a serial number. The color of the triangle signified what each person was: a gypsy, Jewish, homosexual. If you were Jewish, you wore a yellow patch. Green designated criminal, and the Polish people wore red. Long narrative copy on this film poster was not necessary. The simple, isolated objects historically acquired powerful and significant meaning. Trepkowski used straightforward composition, paring down the imagery to only what was important. He was able to distill the content to the simplest statement. For example, the anti-war poster on the right from 1953 shows a war-ravaged city inside the outline of a dropping bomb with the single verbal message, "No." The realism that was adequate for Trepkowski and the symbolism that had arisen out of the devastation of war no longer worked for the next generation of Polish poster artists. These artists began to use metaphoric imagery. This kind of visual communication demanded a more active participation from the viewer. Henryk Tomaszewski became the spiritual head of Polish graphic design after Trepkowski's untimely death. He was known as the father of the new generation. This poster is for a play, Marie and Napoleon, in 1964. It was a play about Napoleon's love affairs. Tomaszewski developed a brighter, more colorful, and aesthetically pleasing style far removed from Tadeusz Trepkowski's somber depiction of war-torn tragedy. Posters for theater and festivals were designed and created with torn and cut paper. Even letter forms were hand-cut. In his 1959 poster for the sculptor Henry Moore's exhibition, letters are hand-cut and pasted down. Notice how the irregular baseline of the letter forms creates this expansive space of the gallery, emphasizing the three-dimensionality of the sculptor's work. By creating this depth on the page, Tomaszewski brings the viewer into the exhibit. Each Polish poster artist had their own distinct style. Roman Cieślewicz was closely associated with the Polish avant-garde theater. In 1962, an organization called the Graphic Arts Publishers in Warsaw created a juried show, where 12 posters a year were chosen for publication to promote the circus. In an effort to keep the posters clean and elegant, they established one rule. The only type that could be in the design was the word cirque, meaning circus. All the other information about the performances needed to fall on the printed strip below the poster. One of the first selected posters was by Cieślewicz. In this design, he collaged letter forms to create the word cirque. and a clown is combined with a high-contrast photo of an elephant for a whimsical and delightful character. On the left is a poster for Katastropha, a 1961 Hungarian movie about the catastrophe of a collapsed building and overpass. Czeslavich collages a high-contrast map of the Hungarian city with a 19th-century-old engraving of an eye to create a gnarly creature set against a bold fire-engine red background. The poster on the right is for a 1974 opera, The Devils of Loudon. It's a true story based on a 17th-century priest accused of sexual exploits with nuns. Horrified face-like shapes make up an evil and satiric beast. Vladimir Sforzy is inspired by the folk art and early 20th century fine art of Poland, introducing a more painterly quality to his posters. With more than 2,500 designs credited to his name, he was one of the most sought-after Polish poster artists. He designed posters primarily for the music and film industry. In his 1974 poster for Jimi Hendrix, Sforzy captures the electricity of the Hendrix guitar riffs with his swirling brushstrokes. He drew the hair into the wet paint with the opposite end of the brush. He would scrape away the paint to reveal the white canvas or underlayer of paint. We see this approach again in the exhibition poster for Toulouse-Lautrec. Every possible organization, especially those in the cultural arena, were vying for a poster painted by one of the famous artists. These are all by Sforzy. According to Sforzy, there were years when he was making a poster every week, and even so, he often had to decline a commission. Sforzy's style was perfect to capture the essence of films like Apocalypse Now, the work of the generation of Polish poster artists who built the Polish poster school. All had one thing in common: a distinctly personal gesture in one form or another. The Polish poster is predominantly made with brushes, chalks, pastels, and paints. Unlike modernism, there is very little photography in these posters. To these artists, the only valid expression of one's ideas is by the human hand to paper or canvas. In a way, this is what makes Polish poster art unique even today. Each poster is a genuine expression of the artist's feelings toward the subject. It's not just a clever slogan or image. Let's look at a couple of European postmodernists. The music and theater of the times was a driving force for this more expressive and subjective aesthetic. The work of German graphic designer Gunther Kaiser uses photography and constructed sculptural objects to create convincingly real conceptual posters. His 1978 poster for the Frankfurt Jazz Festival on the left is a perfect example of how Kaiser uses photography to give the impression of reality. He created a moss-covered tree stump in the form of a trumpet. Working with a photographer, he stages his conceptual objects in a studio, lights them, and shoots them to appear real. On the right is a poster for Berlin Jazz Days created in 1975. A musician's face emerges from a peeling poster of an older jazz performance from a bygone era, conveying the roots of jazz. And everything Kaiser created was made by hand before photographing. In an interview, he was asked how he starts designing, and he said he always listens to music every day, and that he has to listen to the music before designing for it. And from the music, the image comes. In his most famous poster titled Medusa Head, Kaiser created the imagery for a poster promoting Jimi Hendrix's 1969 performance in Stuttgart, Germany. It was made with three-dimensional colored wires protruding out of a two-dimensional portrait of the musician. The Alabama Blues Concert, on the right, from 1966, was in the heat of the civil rights movement. Kaiser combines a dove, the sign of peace, over a civil rights demonstration seen at the bottom of the bird's tail, to create a strong symbol for freedom and justice. Wooden letterpressed forms emulate country music show print posters. In France, Robert Masson, known simply as Masson, was a French graphic designer and typographic genius. Masson inspired the design world in the 1960s by dramatizing type and introducing what we now call expressive typography. From his book of Eugène Ionesco's 1964 play, The Bald Soprano, he used lettering and typography as concrete expressions. Spreads combined the pictorial conventions of comic book narrative with futurist typography and Dada poetry to recreate UNESCO's theater of the absurd. This was in the days of metal type. Masson would letterpress the text with metal type onto rubber and then bend and photograph it. He shows in the photo on the left how he can stretch and distort the expressive type, capturing the actor's voice inflections. The image on the right shows an old mechanical of the rubber taped down to a board for reproduction. Here's a mechanical showing the pasted down letterforms collaged and layered before they were reproduced. And this is a spread from the printed page with a similar composition. From UNESCO's Frenzy for Two, the words overlap and collide on the page in reckless abandon. They smear and run into ink blots, making concrete statements. All of those blotches are not random. They are graphic translations of sound effects, outbursts, and words. A shift happened toward an approach focused on self-expression and personal experience. This rebellion soon garnered a name: Postmodernism. It was a drastic departure from modernism's utopian visions, which had been based on clarity and simplicity. Its key principles were complexity and contradiction. Philosophically, it was a rebellion against authority. It was widespread experimentation and a resurgence of historicism. Everything modernism was not. And its central aim was to replace the universality, the homogeneous capitalist idiom, with a plurality of competing ideas, styles, and voices. Designers salvaged trash and distressed clean typography. Let's look at a few of the designers that captured the spirit of a postmodern aesthetic. In America, one of the rebellions against capitalism was the hippie subculture. The summer of love was happening on both coasts. On the West Coast, it was centered in the Haight-Ashbury district of San Francisco, and the tone was dictated by rock and roll, free love, and psychedelic drugs. People came for the music, the mind-bending drugs, to resist the Vietnam War and the 1960s American orthodoxy, or they simply came to escape a summer of boredom. But one thing's for sure, they left an enduring legacy. Almost 60 years ago, throngs of American youth descended on New York and San Francisco to join this cultural revolution. By early 1966, Helms and a competing promoter, Bill Graham, had begun producing weekly dances. These rock and roll concert promoters for the Fillmore and Avalon, these small concert halls in San Francisco, became the main client for young designers. Concerts included these fantastic light shows projecting on the walls as bands like the Grateful Dead and Jimi Hendrix performed. And designers created posters for both venues. Bill Graham's at the Fillmore Auditorium and Helms at the Avalon Ballroom. The light shows inspired color, form, pattern, even typography. No other artist had more work than Wes Wilson. He was a self-taught designer who was influenced by the world around him. Wilson became the originator of the psychedelic poster. The concert poster on the left for the association was Wilson's first psychedelic poster. It features red, flame-like lettering on a green background, using color and ink on paper to create values that vibrate as much as the light shows themselves. These posters hung on the walls of apartments more than they were posted on the streets, which was an unusual shift for the nature of a poster. They became decorative. The poster on the right for the Grateful Dead's appearance at the famous Fillmore Auditorium uses Vienna secessionist Alfred Roller-inspired type and undulating Art Nouveau lines. In reaction to the prevailing clean Swiss type of the time, whitespace was the bête noire of the psychedelic poster designer. A poster for the Byrds concert at the Fillmore once again uses lettering that has been inspired by Alfred Roller. Like Roller, legibility was not Wilson's ultimate goal. However, you can see here that he increased legibility of the lettering of the main attraction, the Byrds, with a three-dimensional drop shadow. In addition, he opened up the counterforms. Here's a poster for a gig at the Avalon Ballroom, that other popular concert hall. Clearly, Wilson draws on design precedents. We've seen his type influenced from the Vienna secession movement, and his graphics from French Art Nouveau. This is an example where Wilson is influenced by the extreme geometry of the Russian constructivists, like this magazine spread by Alexander Rodchenko. You can see the influence in Wilson's Wonderland heading. These are two more iconic posters for the Grateful Dead, where the graphics fill in every available space. It's interesting to note that Wilson has introduced a softness to the letterforms so they harmonize perfectly with the panels of illustration, and in doing so, they've become easier to read. According to a newspaper report, I quote, "Respectable and intelligent businessmen were unable to comprehend the lettering on these posters, yet they communicated well enough to fill auditoriums with a younger generation who deciphered rather than read the messages." Rock and roll influenced the psychedelic poster in San Francisco, but on the opposite coast, starting in the early 70s, hip-hop inspired a radical departure from modernism in the South Bronx. And like the psychedelic poster, the hip-hop flyer was a promise of a multi-sensory music event. The flyers were photocopied or mimeographed and distributed to promote the music block parties happening in the rec halls, community centers, and skating rinks around the neighborhood. Lonnie Wood, known as Phase 2, pioneered the visual language of the hip-hop flyer and poster for names like Grandmaster Flash and Kool Herc. Working with ChartPack, a cheaper version of Letraset rub-down letters, Phase 2 would use Xerox images, hand drawings, and magazine cutouts to create what is referred to as a mechanical by pasting up the graphics and rubbing down the type one letter at a time. And then the mechanical would be reproduced for posting and to be handed out. In 1986, Phase 2 became the art director of International Get Hipped Times, also known as the Subway Sun, Get Hip Times, Tight, but always IG Times or IGT. You can see here the frenetic collage as he puts photographic images with hand-drawn images and the street writings from buildings and trains. IGT was the first zine about aerosol culture. Phase 2 started as a New York City aerosol writer in the early 70s, and he's been credited for originating the bubble letters. Here you see Phase 2's signed copy of the zine. The publication devoted early coverage to the developing HIV/AIDS crisis, apartheid in South Africa, police brutality in American cities, and the impact of the Second Amendment on inner-city crime. According to its creator, David Schmidlap, "If you know anything about the IG Times, we were a controversial inner-city, international, underground publication, questioning anybody and anything that was put forth in the name of culture." Inspired by Phase 2, Buddy Esquire became known as the Flyer King. His designs for hip-hop shows were inspired by Art Deco and its connection to the Jazz Age. They were a way to elevate the parties and make them, in his words, classy. Esquire referred to his own style as Neo-Deco. He spent hours in the public library studying the principles of typography to perfect his aesthetic not only for his promotional flyers, but also for his style writing. Like Phase 2, Esquire started as an aerosol writer, and also like Phase 2, he saw his work as an art form, elevating the style writing from the graffiti on the streets. Between 1978 and 1984, Buddy Esquire designed over 300 hip-hop flyers. Here are just two. On the left is a flyer for a show at the T-Connection on November 11, 1979. Geometric shapes are filled with pen dot stippling to signify aerosol spray paint. 2 years later, he creates this flyer for the Kips Bay Boys Club. He isolates photos, hand-draws portraits, and sets them into geometric style forms that frame the typography. This is a prime example of Buddy Esquire's Neo-Deco style. So in Haight-Ashbury, we saw the psychedelic poster. In the South Bronx, we saw the hip-hop flyers. And we looked at the creation of conceptual images as a significant design approach in Poland, Germany, and France. Now let's look at the conceptual approach that developed in Manhattan and dominated the design world of the 60s, 70s, and 80s. Reynold Ruffins with Seymour Chwast, seen here with John Elkin standing, along with Milton Glaser and Ed Sorel, began a studio in 1954. They were all friends and grads from Cooper Union in 1951. The studio got its name from this bi-monthly publication, the Pushpin Almanac. They eventually became Pushpin Studios. The designers received enough freelance from this publication that they began the studio. And that studio set the standards and style for American design and illustration for decades to come. Pushpin Studios reinvigorated historical styles and returned narrative and figurative illustration to the design equation. This is Reynold Ruffin's work in the Pushpin Graphic No. 21, 1959. His graphic technique defied the look of modernism in commercial art, ushering in postmodern design. Here are just a few examples of Ruffin's beautiful, intricate, black and white illustrations used in promotional materials for Pushpin Studios. Another co-founder, Milton Glaser, is impossible to categorize. He consistently reinvented his techniques and motifs throughout his 60-year career. These psychedelic-inspired designs are created for 17 magazine in 1967. There were a total of 4 drawings, each illustrating a different skin condition: normal, dry, oily, or combination. The 2 shown here are combination and normal. This is an album cover for The Sound of Harlem from 1964. During the 1960s, Milton Glaser created images of flat color. Figures were defined by thin black contour lines, inspired by the flowing Art Nouveau lines, the Japanese ukiyo-e prints with the flat color planes, and Matisse's cutouts. Glaser drew on the inspiration from his historical knowledge of art. Glaser's work is a prime example of using precedents to draw on influences of the past to inform something new. The portrait of Jerry Garcia, the spiritual leader of the Grateful Dead, was illustrated for Rolling Stone magazine in 1995 after Garcia's death. Like much of Glaser's work, it's conceptual. Glaser shows the image of Garcia beginning to fade from memory, even though his music will endure. In 1989, Glaser was commissioned to design a series of posters for Juilliard, the extraordinary music school in New York City. On the right is one of his posters from that series. The concept, a ladder leading to the stars, suggests the idea of aspiration and creativity. Glaser was inspired by this painting by Jean Miro that used a ladder leading to the heavens. Glaser had a motto, I quote, "If you're going to steal, steal from the best." It clearly illustrates the myth of the completely original idea. We are all inspired by great works and stand on the shoulders of those who went before us, no doubt. Even the visual genius, Milton Glaser, acknowledges this with a sense of humor. This 1966 poster was produced for CBS Records. The hair is highly stylized, inspired by Art Nouveau, and laid on a simple silhouette profile of Bob Dylan. Add to that the simple geometric lettering. The lettering, by the way, was later developed by Glaser into a full typeface called Baby Teeth. Now nearly 6 million of these posters were printed and distributed in a best-selling album all over the world. As a result, it is one of the most recognizable images to a global generation of people. Milton Glaser also created the simple, iconic I Heart New York. Conceptually brilliant and diverse, Milton Glaser constantly reinvented his style to fit the communication needs. And one more Pushpin co-founder I'd like to talk about is Seymour Chwast. He was inspired by children's art, folk art, expressionist woodcuts, and comic books. His vision was very personal and communicated to a wide audience with resonance. In this moving announcement for Elektra Productions from 1965, each letter travels across the page by walking, riding, propelled by locomotive power, moving to its new location. Old engravings are appropriated and collaged to combine with the additional illustration to form the message. Bold type spells out "War is madness." The iconic sign of the bomb is dropped out of the illustration directly over the senses. The eyes and mouth indicating the blindness and muted state of mankind in the face of war. On the right, this 1968 poster protests the bombing of Hanoi, Vietnam. Working with a woodcut image, Chwast lays red in the hat, mouth, and shirt. With the green face, it becomes a 3-color poster. And inside of Uncle Sam's mouth is the account of a village of Hanoi being bombed, with warplanes radically altering the meaning of the words, "End bad breath." This is an exhibition of Seymour Chwast's posters in a gallery in New York. At the forefront of the postmodernist movement was a graphic designer, typographer, and teacher who pioneered and led the revolt against the international typographic style, Wolfgang Weingart. He studied under Emile Reuter and became faculty working alongside Armin Hoffmann at the Basel School in Switzerland. Weingart introduced his students to what is now called the New Wave, a more intuitive, eclectic departure from the stark mathematical approach and the neutral objective organization of the grid. He challenged the limitations of the increasingly predictable modernist style and his own mentors, and he began to create expressive work that broke the mold of classic Swiss typography. His eclectic, rebellious approach was known as New Wave or Swiss punk. Legibility was often sacrificed to expression through experimentation with letterpress printing, typography, paper, ink, woodcuts, and form. Weingart's experiments utilized wide word spacing and letter spacing, unpredictable contrasts in weights, and random intuitive placement. Designs were based on expression, this intuitive expression. He sacrificed readability for this expression. Form follows intuition, was form follows function as far as the postmodernist was concerned. Weingart consciously sought to breathe a new spirit into typography, questioning the rules of the Swiss masters that he learned from. Designs like these were created with older historical technology, the letterpress. They were designed and constructed by building the composition with physical typographic matter right on the press. It's a wonderful hands-on and experimental process. Letters turned on their side, combined with other letter forms, like I and M, become a B, or a turned M becomes an E. He infused blocks of copy with chunky black rectangles, and sarcastically called his type sunshine type, or bunny type, or, to mock the modernist philosophies, for the people type. And in the mid-1970s, his designs evolved as he began to play with the photographic printing processes of film overlays and light exposure. These are two examples where he's working with collaged film ephemera. Weingart had a profound influence on American graphic design. He taught a number of design students who studied with him in Basel and studied under him in America at Yale's summer program. Weingart had a profound influence on April Greiman, an American graphic designer he taught in Basel. After studying under Weingart, she taught at Philadelphia College of Arts and then worked in New York briefly before moving to LA in 1976. She quickly emerged as a leader in America with Weingart's New Wave ideas. As art director of Wet Magazine, she influenced a generation with her twist on New Wave and postmodern design. In Greiman's work, she achieves a sense of depth in her typography, moving forms backward and forward in space on the printed page. You can see she was heavily influenced by the pronouns of Ella Zitsky, as evidenced in the 1980s ad for the grand opening of a new LA restaurant, the China Club. This 1978 poster for California Institute of the Arts, CalArts, combines Greiman's graphic sensibilities with the photography of Jamie Odgers. It's an example of Greiman's approach to the picture plane. Notice the foreground image of the hand. With its isolation and placement, it appears to project off the plane and jut into the space beyond the background. Simultaneously isolated images fall into the background, creating a deep sense of space on the two-dimensional page. Typography, photography, and design elements overlay and recede to create this deep space. Now, in 1984, Greiman became an early pioneer of the new technology after the introduction of the Macintosh computer. She actually stood in line at Macy's department store to purchase the first Mac with 120K memory. With this limited technology, Greiman explored bitmap fonts, layering, combining video and print through early digital technologies. She designed this poster for the Maryland Institute College of Art, announcing one of her lectures. All the components were generated on the Mac. It's a terrific example of her pioneering spirit. The self-portrait was produced at a party when she played for the first time with a video digitizer, an old, inexpensive software that translates video into pixels. Bitmapped type was produced by the Mac for a dot matrix printer, and the pixelation of the font was exploited for this exciting new visual aesthetic. This 1987 fold-in poster for an issue of Design Quarterly is another example of Greiman's hybrid techniques. In this life-size, 6-foot-long autobiographic poster, Greiman pulls together her experimentation with early digital and reproductive processes and uses a scan of her own body, layered over her idealized spiritual double, captioned with annotations. This was all created on a Mac with a 1-bit black and white screen, 512 by 342 pixels, basically about 7 inches by 5 inches. It was created with a printer that only printed 8.5 by 11 inches and a scanner not much bigger. April Greiman led the charge in American graphic design's radical postmodern departure from Swiss design while reinventing the visual landscape. And she ushered in the digital age of design. In her own words, I quote, "It was art and science merging, which were and still are my favorite things." Now, while April Greiman rebelled against modernist mathematical underlying grid structures and the use of Helvetica, other postmodernist designers rebelled against the modernists' rejection of historicism and ornament. And many times they use modernists' own work as historical references or copies, and at times literally copying works from the past as a nostalgic nod. Paula Scher was at the forefront of a movement based on historicism called retro. Scher became fascinated with past visual languages like ukiyo-e prints, Russian constructivism, and Swiss tourism posters. Do you remember seeing this poster before? When Scher created or recreated this ad for Swatch watches, she more than just emulated the poster of Herbert Matter. Paula Scher used every element from Herbert Matter's Swiss tourism poster from 1934. Scher uses Matter's design to make the romanticized lifestyle connection between Swatch and the Swiss Alps of the 1930s. The ultimate question in the design field became, is there anything original we can credit to Paula Scher? Or is she just ripping off Herbert Matter? This Best of Jazz poster for CBS Records was created in 1979. Copying elements from the Russian posters of Alexander Rodchenko, Paula Scher incorporated her own contemporary sense of design into this composition. Much of Scher's work is primarily with typography and letter forms now. Filling every surface of the page with letter forms is one of her obsessions, in her own words. The poster on the left is one of a series in an ad campaign for the Public Theater from 1995. On the right, this MTV Free Your Mind poster is about the derogatory language toward women, and it's all handwritten. Here, you see Scher applying typography to architecture. Lucent Technologies for the Arts Education, or the New Jersey Performing Arts Center, allowed Paula Scher to paint the exterior of the building white and then cover it with words that explained what was going on inside of the building. Scher covered every surface of the building, including the ductwork. Scher's interest in historical and eccentric type and large environmental lettering earned her a place in the Second National Design Triennial, a Smithsonian tribute by the Cooper Hewitt Design Museum. Another postmodernist, Rudy van der Lans, trained and practiced graphic design in the Netherlands before emigrating to America in 1981. He founded the graphic design magazine Emigre in 1984, which ran until 2005 when it stopped publication. It focused on the social and cultural effects of primarily postmodern graphic design on society. For over 20 years and over 60 issues, Emigre has been a source book of ideas, typography, images, products, and even music for an entire generation of graphic designers. Van der Lans would use the magazine to promote underground bands, create photographic essays, anything that piqued his interest. And it was inspiring, as well as a great way to promote his type designs and his type foundry. His wife, Zuzanna Lico, runs the Digital Type Foundry. These are some of her early bitmap fonts: Emperor, Oakland, and Emigre. These early designs were created for the early publications of Emigre, designed to print on a dot matrix printer without distorting the type. By 1990, Emigre began to license and distribute idiosyncratic designs that were created by many different designers working for Emigre. But Susanna Lico has created some of the more popular, like Mrs. Eves, a revival of the transitional phase from the 18th century, Baskerville, designed by the printer punch cutter John Baskerville. Lico named the type Mrs. Eves after Baskerville's housekeeper mistress, Sarah Eves, whom he later married. The name Emigre was chosen because Vanderlands embraced and highlighted a variety of cultural influences, and the fact that living in different cultural environments significantly impacted his creativity. The issue on the left, for example, includes an article on Japanese designer Takenobu Igarashi and the Netherlands design firm Hardwerken. Emigre's experimental approach with every publication demonstrated to designers everywhere how to push technology and redefine graphic design. The publication on the right highlighted the design department of Cranbrook. Issue 10 of Emigre highlighted the experimental design coming out of Cranbrook and the theory-driven design of the graduate design program and its co-chair, Catherine McCoy. This is one of Catherine McCoy's posters for the program, communicating the simultaneity of meaning and overlapping forms, where image can be read and text can be seen, an underlying concept of postmodernism. In London, designer Neville Brody worked first as an album cover designer and then moved into editorial design for a number of British magazines, The Face, ID, and Arena. Brody never officially learned the rules of correct typography. Instead, he created his own rules and, in turn, his own designs. Drawing on past convention of heraldic design, he applied this aesthetic to punk bands and album design, like this 1985 album cover for P-Funk. He hand-lettered the forms with mathematical precision, and by following the simple rules of heraldic design, he used simple, bold forms. The album takes on the appearance of a heraldic shield. From 1981 to 1996, Neville Brody was the art director of the British lifestyle magazine The Face. He saw the magazine as a medium that existed in both time and space. He understood there was a continuity with each issue, and he had the same audience. So he began to play with that notion and created an evolution of this logotype over 6 issues, eventually changing from typographic form to abstract glyph, though readers and subscribers were taught to decode the information. In this spread from The Face, illustrating sunglasses and their shapes, Brody incorporated old nostalgic photos to show similar styles to reinforce the retro classic contemporary styles. He put his type through a Xerox machine and copied the copies several times to distress and break down the typographic form. Just one of the postmodernist treatments of typographic form. While Brody was distressing type with Xerox machines in Great Britain, an American designer also challenged the conventions of editorial design. David Carson began his career as a world-ranking professional surfer. He began to design the magazines for Surfer, Beach Culture, Transworld Skateboarding, and Musician. And the nature of these magazines and their readership gave Carson complete freedom to invent the magazine design. But these were small publications and had limited visibility. We may never have heard of David Carson, but in 1992, he launched Raygun, a music lifestyle magazine that brought his designs into an international arena and influenced a generation of young designers. The left cover is the premiere issue of Raygun. It flew off the racks at mainstream bookstores like Barnes & Noble. The music magazine's radical design perfectly encapsulated the 90s grunge era. In Raygun 14 from 1994, Carson designs the spread for Morrissey by chance. He created through accidental discovery. If type gets cut off, enlarged, taped over, and if by chance an accident works with the meaning and looks good, that's what gets printed. On the right, Carson manipulates and blurs the text. As Carson explains, it encourages closer engagement from the viewer to decipher the articles. Carson's complete disregard for legibility in grids plants him securely in the category of postmodern. Clarity is sacrificed to expression. Typography works on multiple levels, then, engaging the reader with visual content and communicating the verbal text simultaneously. And sometimes legibility was not even a concern. Carson found this article so boring that he decided to print the entire article in Zaft dingbats. It's the actual content, but the typographic symbols replace the letter forms in the typographic spread. Another pioneer of the new editorial design that emerged in the 80s and 90s is Fred Woodward. Woodward became art director of Rolling Stone magazine in 1987. And Woodward was known for matching the typefaces of each issue with the editorial content, making audacious typography the hallmark of Rolling Stone. He spoke of his typographic design, saying, "Sometimes the type was married to the image, sometimes the type was at war with the image, and sometimes the type was the image." When Woodward created this spread for Sinead O'Connor, he changed Rolling Stone magazine. It was the first of years of exploration into bold typographic experiments and full-page portraits. And this is a 3-page fold-out. Woodward strived to be on the forefront of not only typography, but illustration. In this issue on the Soviet bomb, Woodward commissioned top illustrator Matt Mahurin for the article. Woodward's typographic design evokes Russian constructivism in Cyrillic letter forms. By reversing the Roman letter forms, he emulated another language. In this 1994 spread, a full-page portrait is bordered by display type running vertically. Letterforms on the right dominate the page, stacked and overlapped, but easily legible. Woodward says he never used a typeface more than once. He wanted to change it up in every publication to reinvent the magazine's design solely based on its content. Historicism, retro design, vernacular forms, intuitive typography, playfulness in form and color palette. Stylistic graphic design replaced the modernist Swiss aesthetic for a period in the later part of the 20th century. It continues today in a broad and open virtual and analog forum. These characteristics and approaches were given a name that many still dispute: postmodernism.